And then the other thing that we spend a fair amount of time doing is talking about unconscious bias. And I'm fairly sure most of you are familiar with the concept of unconscious bias. But one of the things I try to get across very clearly to the people participating in these workshops is that unconscious bias isn't something that men do to women. It's something that we all do to different groups of people. And so regardless of who we are, we bring with us unconscious biases. And that unconscious bias can limit the diversity and therefore the excellence that an institution can achieve. One of the easiest ways to have people understand unconscious bias was the study by Malcolm Gladwell in 2005 on height and leadership. And he discovered that the percentage of men in the US who were over 6 feet tall was 15%, whereas the percentage of people who were over 6 feet tall and were the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies was 58%. So clearly there was an unconscious bias in the hiring of CEOs that tall was somehow a sign of confidence and competence. And I refer people to the Harvard implicit assumption test. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but if you're not, I suggest you have a look at it. It offers a chance for you to look for your own unconscious biases. And I'll tell you a little secret. I always go back and do this every couple of years. I think it's important. And for years, I was very proud of myself because I had no bias indicated between women and nurturing and men and science. I was right down the middle. I didn't see a bias in either way. Then I had children. And I think as a result of my years spent caregiving as the primary caregiver and nurturer for my children, when I went back and did this a couple of years ago, I came away with a bias. And I did have a bias towards women in nurturing and away from women in science. Now, what's important about that, I think, is two things. I tell this story in the workshops that I do because I want them to understand that even after having devoted most of my career to doing work around equity and diversity, even I can have unconscious biases, but also to help them to understand that what we're doing and what we're experiencing at the time does have an impact on our unconscious biases, and that simply being aware of them is one of the best ways to overcome them. But of course, being scientists, many of them are not convinced by my personal stories. And so they're clearly not sociologists. And so I turn then to the peer-reviewed literature, which shows again the way in which unconscious bias operates, particularly within academia, and how it is something that, that we all do. It's not something that is just done by one group to another. I'm not going to go into detail about these studies. I'd be happy to tell you more about them afterwards. But these are the two studies that I talk about in particular because they have very big samples and very robust results. And what this one, I'll just go to the last slide. What this one compared was men and women who were being awarded funding from the Swedish Medical Research Council. And what they found was that women had to have done significantly more work to be judged to be equal to men who had done significantly less work. And so there was clearly a bias in the way in which the work was being assessed and in a determination of what was enough for these women to be seen to be as, their work to be as valid as that produced by the men in the study. Likewise, this study is about CVs, which are randomly, it's the same CV and it's randomly given either a man's name or a woman's name, and it's for a student applying for a lab manager position. And again, remember, the CVs are exactly the same. The people selecting showed a significant bias against women and for the men. And what was kind of I think more important here was the other ways in which this bias became clear. So first of all, we see the difference between men and women in terms of their rating of competence. Again, it's exactly the same CV, but men are rated more competent than women. And then, therefore, they are more hireable than the women. But interestingly, there were also differences in the kind of mentoring that they would be willing to provide the men and the women, and the salaries that they would provide the men and the women. And remember that these are students just beginning their academic careers, so the long-term impact of less money and less mentoring would be quite significant on the men and women as they advanced.